Okay, so we're going to talk about Shemitah once in 7 years. This is will be my second Shemitah here in Israel. That's a big zechut. There are some people here who've had rather more than that. Dickie, I can see, is with us. He's had a few Shmitot already. But the laws are complicated, and you've got to really know what you're doing. And the more I looked into this and the more I prepared for this series, the more I realized that I didn't know as much as I thought I knew about it. And I've learnt a great deal more. So hopefully we'll be able to together navigate these things. I have a little confession to make, and that is I don't think I'm going to get through all this material in 3 weeks. So we may go over into a 4th week. Who knows? But I suppose if that's the worst thing, then it won't be too bad. So we've got 25 people joined at the moment. I think that it's going to be difficult to do questions as we go along. So I think what we'll do is I will go through some material today. If you've got questions, just jot them down. I'm happy to stay online after we've finished for as long as anybody wants to discuss or answer questions. And then, of course, those of you that want to go, well, you can do that at any time, no problem. I'm going to split this up into sections. What I would like to do first is to go through the sources of Shemitah in the Torah and understand what Shemitah is all about from a sort of principle point of view, from a perspective of the actual mitzvah or the mitzvot, because there's more than one mitzvah, the mitzvot themselves. And then, not this week, but next week, I'm going to move on to the practicalities, and I'm going to split that up into 2 as well. I'm going to split that up into what to do with your own gardens in Israel. If you live in Israel, if you have a farm, or if you have a field, or if you have a garden in Israel. Those of you who live in apartments, this may not be as relevant, but some of you live in houses, as do I, with a garden. Some of you have fields even. As do my kids. So we've got to know what to do. And the third section I'm going to do is to talk about what we have to do in our kitchens with Shemitah produce. And then finally, I will talk about how to get out of any of the Shemitah problems. Now, I'm going to leave that right up to the end, because I'm not very keen on the whole idea of getting out of it. And you'll understand why, I hope, by the end of tonight's session. So let's just start by talking about the chutzniks, those that don't live in Israel, because, of course, the mitzvah of Shemitah only applies to produce grown in Israel, only applies to fields and land in Israel. So what's it got to do with us outside of Israel? What can we get out of it? Well, the answer really is not very much, to be honest, because you have a problem. Because one of the things you're not allowed to do is to eat produce which is grown, inverted commas, illegally against the halacha in Israel. So when I was living in Chutz La'aretz, all I really understood about Shemitah was that I couldn't eat Israeli produce during this year. I had to go and look and see where this produce was made. If it was grown in Israel, I had to put it down. I couldn't buy it. If you live in Chutz La'aretz, the truth is that that's just about all you can do, because there is no way of knowing in Chutz La'aretz how it was grown, whether it was grown in accordance with Shemitah rules, whether it was harvested in accordance with Shemitah rules. All you know is that it came from Israel. And the majority of produce which is exported from Israel abroad does not comply with Shemitah rules. So the truth is that what I was taught, or I don't know if I was taught it, but what I understood was that you can't eat Israeli produce during Shemitah is true in Chutz La'aretz. And if you are going to spend the whole of Shemitah and most of the next year not going to Israel and eating their fresh produce, and you're not interested in what goes on here, well, you can switch off now, because all you can really say in Chutz La'aretz is that we can't eat Israeli produce during the year because we can't be sure that it's not been grown or harvested illegally. And when I say illegally, I mean against the halacha, and most of it will have been, which is rather sad, really. So when you make aliyah, those of you who are still in Chutz La'aretz, when you make aliyah, hopefully shortly before the next Shemitah, you'll need to start learning the halachot. Those of you who've been here in Israel for less than 6 years, this will be your first Shemitah. As I said before, this is my second. You've got to know your way around the halachot. So we're going to start by looking at the sources in the Torah that speak about Shemitah. Where is the main source of the halachot on Shemitah? And I'm going to share the screen with you. Those of you who've got the printout, the handout that was sent out, you can refer to that. Those are you that don't worry about it. It's going to be on your screen, hopefully on your screen now. Somebody give me a thumbs up if you can see it, please. Yeah, good. Okay. So source number 1 is in Vayikra, Sefer Vayikra. And you can see exactly where it is. It's at the beginning of Parshat Bahar, because there is our word Bahar. And let's just go through these 7 psukim, because the majority of the halachot of Shemitah come from these 7 psukim in Vayikra, in Parshat Bahar. Very quickly, let's go through them. God spoke to Moses. Daber el bnei Yisrael, speak to bnei Israel. Ve'amarta alehem, and you shall say to them, Ki tavo el haaretz, when you will come to the land. Which land? The land of Israel. Asher ani noten lachem, which I'm giving to you. V'shavta haaretz Shabbat lashem. You can see the word v'shavta is the same root as Shabbat. This is a year where the land is resting, as it were, in the same way as we rest on Shabbat. Shavta haaretz. That is the word which tells us what this whole thing is all about, and it's related to the word Shabbat. And then, just in case you don't understand that concept, the Torah tells us clearly what you can do and what you can't do. We all know, don't we, that 6 days you're going to work and the 7th day you rest. Same thing with Shemitah. 6 shanim tizrah sadecha. 6 years you can sow your field. V'shesh shanim tizmor karmecha. And 6 years you can prune your vineyard. V'asafta et tvuata. And you may gather its produce. Its produce, the produce of the fields and the vineyards. Bashana Shvi'it, in the 7th year, Shabbat Shabbaton Yiyeh La'aretz, shall be a complete Shabbat. Shabbat Shabbaton is the expression that we use. Where do we see that expression elsewhere? Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is called Shabbat Shabbaton. Yiyeh La'aretz Shabbat Lashem, it shall be a rest day or a rest year, Lashem, for Hashem. Sadecha lo tizra, your field you shall not sow. V'karmecha, and your vineyard lo tizmor, you shall not prune. Et safiach ketzircha, the aftergrowth of your harvest, we'll come to that later on tonight, hopefully. Lo tiktzor, you cannot harvest. That in vein zirecha, and the grapes that you've put aside for yourself, lo tivtzor, you cannot pick. Shnat Shabbaton yiyeh la'aretz. It's a year of Shabbat for the land. V'haita Shabbat haaretz lachem, and it shall be a rest for the land. Le'ochla. Now this is a very important word. Le'ochla, to eat it. It shall be yours to eat. Who shall eat it? Lecha, for you. Ule'avdecha, and for your servant. Ve'la'amatecha, and for your female servant. Ve'lischircha, and for your hired workers. Ule'toshavacha hagari mimach, and for those people that live with you. In other words, everybody. And this is the key to the mitzvah of Shemitah. That one word there, le'ochla, is the key word, which we will come back to. Ve'livhemtecha, and for your animals, ve'lachaya shebartzecha, and also for the wild animals, the non-domesticated animals that are in the land. Tiyeh kol tvuata le'echol. All this produce shall be to eat. So these last two psukim, 6 and 7, tell us very clearly that the produce should be eaten. And this is something which in Chutz La'aretz is a little bit difficult to get our heads around. Because as I said earlier on, what we do in Chutz La'aretz is we go into the supermarket, we look at the label, we see that it is from Israel, and the one thing we don't do is eat it. We don't eat it, we put it back. And so we're not able to fulfill the mitzvah of Shemitah, because the mitzvah of Shemitah is le'ochla. You're meant to eat the produce of Shemitah. You're not meant to not eat it. Unfortunately, because in Chutz La'aretz we can't guarantee it hasn't been grown illegally, we can't eat it. But the ideal scenario is to eat Shemitah produce which has been grown and harvested according to the halacha. That is the highest level of mitzvah that we can do in Eretz Israel, is to eat Shemitah grown produce with kedusha, and we'll come to kedusha of the produce itself next week. But for the moment, we know from this that in the 7th year, we can't sow a field, we can't prune a vineyard, and we can't gather in produce, because that's what we do in the 6 years. And in the 7th year, you shall not sow, you shall not prune, and you shall not reap and pick your grapes. So there are the 4 main things, a bit like the Avot Melachot, the 39 Avot Melachot of Shabbat. We have the 4 main categories of work that we must not do with the Shemitah year. The parallels between the year of Shemitah and the Shabbat of the week are very powerful, and we'll keep coming back to them. So those are the negative commandments. You shall not. So you shall not sow, you shall not prune, you shall not reap, you shall not gather. Okay. But with Shemitah, there is also a positive commandment, which we've alluded to here, le'ochla, to eat it. That is a mitzvah in the Torah, to eat it. But there's also another mitzvah, which is brought down in Parshat Mishpatim, in Shmot, chapter 23. These 2 psukim here. Shesh shanim tizra et artzecha v'yasavta et tvuata. 6 years you sow your land and gather in your produce. So far, nothing new above what we've said before. But here, look at verse 11. V'hashvi'it, in the 7th year, tishmetena unatashta. You shall release it. You can see you can see the word Shmita in the middle of that word. Tishmetena. Shmita is the same word. You shall release it. Unatashta. Now, natashta means one step further. And here it's translated, it's a good translation, as abandon it. Abandon it. And then what happens? So you abandon your field, but then what happens? Va'achlu evyonei amecha. And the poor people shall eat it. V'yitram tochal chayat hasadeh. And what's left over, the animals shall eat. And you shall do the same thing to your vineyards and your olive trees. So here in Sefer Shmot, we have an added feature. It's not just what you can't do during Shemitah, which is to plant and sow and reap and prune, but what you must do. You must release your field and abandon it. And in Hebrew, there is a concept of hefker. I'm sure some of you have heard that word, hefker. It means to be wild. If you say that your child is running hefker, it means he's running around being a hefkenik. Means he's running around without any rules, without anybody telling him what to do, with no ownership, if you like. So when you are mafkir something, it means that you relinquish ownership from it. Something which you find in the street, which belongs to somebody else, you have to return their lost article. But if that article is hefker, if it's ownerless, then you don't have to return it because it doesn't have an owner. So this is the mitzvah of mafkir, of abandoning, of making your field ownerless. So it means that it doesn't actually belong to you. It belongs to everybody. It specifically belongs to the poor. Now, if you just had that pasuk, you would think that in order to go and eat produce from Shemitah, that you would have to take a means test, because only poor people can eat it. But let me remind you that up here we had this pasuk. V'hayta Shabbat haaretz lachem le'ochla. It shall be for yours to eat. For who? For you, for the servants, for the hired workers, and for everybody. So it's not just for the poor people, it's for everybody. Everybody can eat the produce of Shemitah. And the reason that you can eat it is because it's meant to have been made hefker. It's meant to have been made ownerless. So effectively, the fruit that is growing in my garden is going to be ownerless. It's going to be hefker, which means that with my permission, you can come into my garden. You can't just walk into my garden without my permission, but you can come into my garden once I allow you in, and without my permission, you can pick the fruit off that tree and eat it, because it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to everybody. So we can see we have some positive commandments to be mafkir, to abandon our fields, to make them ownerless, and to leave the food, the fruit, or the vegetables that are growing in the land, to leave them for everybody to eat. And we have negative prohibitions of what we can't do. So let's just have a look at various different opinions as what are the reasons for Shemitah. All of these little charts that you see in the handout are courtesy of Rav Yosef Tzvi Rimon, who is one of the Gdolei Hador of this generation. He is a massive Talmid Chacham, and he has written an excellent book called, surprisingly, well, you probably can't see it on there. It's called Shemitah, Halacha. on Shmitot. And as you can probably see from here, it's a very thick book, and it's an excellent book. In fact, Paul Westbrook's son wrote a little pamphlet, an excellent pamphlet, I might add, on the halachot of Shemitah. And he wasn't very complimentary about most of the contemporary books on Shemitah, with the one exception of Rav Yosef Tzvi Rimon's book, which he quotes as being an excellent book, and I agree entirely with him. So all of these little charts here that I've done are taken from this book with Rav Rimon's permission. I specifically asked him for permission and was granted permission to copy them. So there's a little chart here saying what are the reasons. Well, various Meforshim over the years have given different reasons why Shemitah, what's it all about? What do we learn from the mitzvah of Shemitah? Why are we given the mitzvah? Let's just quickly whiz through these, because it's important to know why we're doing things, not just how to do them. So of course, important how to do them as well. And most of our time is going to be spent going through how to do things, because at the end of the day, we've got to know what we're doing. But it's important to know why we're doing them. And the Rambam, Maimonides, tells us that this is meant to promote the well-being of all people. And he quotes the pasuk that we did before, that it's for he quotes that it's for the poor, and he also quotes that it's for the servants and the hired people and everybody around the Gerim. And it's the idea is that it's to help the poor, so it's to improve our feeling towards the poor people, but also to promote achdut, to promote togetherness. Because if this fruit and vegetables which is growing in a field belongs to everybody, then that puts everybody on the same footing, and it's to promote well-being, says the Rambam. Rambam, of course, is the rationalist par excellence, and Rambam says, by the way, there is also it's also a good thing to make the earth more fertile, to leave the land fallow. Many cultures and many economies understand the need for not over farming land and to leave land fallow for a period of time, whether it's every 2 years, every 3 years, every 7 years, various different opinions. Clearly, however, the idea of making the land more fertile is not the main reason for Shemitah. It's even the Rambam, the wonderful rationalist, doesn't give that as his main reason. The reason that I say that that's not the primary reason for Shemitah is because if that was the case, it wouldn't only apply to Eretz Yisrael. It would apply to wherever you are farming. If the idea is to preserve the land, why should we only preserve the land in Eretz Yisrael? Why should there be a difference between Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz? So there is no mitzvah of Shemitah outside of Eretz Yisrael. And so this idea of increasing the fertility of the land is a secondary reason, not a primary reason. I'm not saying it should be dismissed, of course not, but it's not the primary reason. That's the Rambam's idea. The Rambam is so it should promote the well-being, and it's an idea, it's a part of tzedakah. The Chinuch says a slightly different idea, and that is that we human beings who own things, particularly when we own property, karka, land is in halachic terms the best possible property you can have. Karka is compared to things called metaltalin, things that are movable objects. So, watches and jewelry and things like that. They are secondary in terms of their quality of property. The best property you can, the best objects you can own is karka, is land. But, says the Chinuch, once in 7 years, we have to be reminded, especially those of us that own property, that own land, we have to be reminded that it's not ours, it belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and we are only the guardians of it. And therefore, says the Chinuch, these mitzvot come along to teach us how to relinquish. It's not easy. It's not easy. When you've got something, it's not easy to give it away. So this mitzvah of making something hefker, to be mafkir something, unatashta, to abandon something which is yours, that is a difficult thing to do. And it teaches us a midah, a character trait, which is very important, which is to realize that it's not kochi v'otzem yadi. Not everything that I have is that due to the power of my own hand. There, but for the grace of God. So it's teaching us, says the Chinuch, the quality of yielding and relinquishing. And there we are. He goes on to say that we remember that it doesn't just come by its own power. There is a master over it and over its owner. So it's not kochi v'otzim yadi, it's not the power of my own hand. And of course, if we are not working the field, we have to put our trust in HaKadosh Baruch Hu that he's going to fulfill his share of the bargain. And the Pasuk tells us that we will get a triple lot in the 6th year to cover the 6th, 7th, and 8th years. And it is a feature of emunah, of faith and bitachon and trust in Hashem. These are all the ideas of the Chinuch. Again, the Chinuch goes further and he says it's to teach us that actually the heaven and earth don't belong to us. We're only leaseholders. We're not freeholders. The freehold is held by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's those ideas there, which are all really one for the Chinuch, which is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu owns the earth, and we need to learn the message that it doesn't belong to us in perpetuity. Then the Ibn Ezra, he says that we need to have an opportunity in the same way as on Shabbat, we down tools. It's a time for rest. It's a time for learning. It's a time for connecting with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We have the idea, it's also a fairly modern idea, that somebody, when they've worked for a certain period of time, will be granted, and we use the word in English, don't we, a sabbatical. What's a sabbatical? It might not be a whole year. A sabbatical is a time period where you go off from work and you do something different. And this is granted to people often in various jobs. You can have it, certainly in teaching jobs, it's quite often. In university professors, they often have a contract which allows them a sabbatical to go and study and to go and learn and to go and renew their passion for their subject. So the Ibn Ezra and Rav Kalisha say that this is a sabbatical for us to go and occupy ourselves with the Torah during that year. And Rav Kook, very true to Rav Kook's spirituality. Those of you who've never learned any Rav Kook, recommend it. It's hard going, I warn you, but if you can relate to it, it's absolutely phenomenal, because Rav Kook is one of the most spiritual writers that there are, and he always speaks about the spirituality of life. And here he's saying that Rav Kook is saying that the Shemita year is an opportunity for us to remove ourselves from the mundane activities and to elevate ourselves, not only as an individual, which we do every Shabbat, but as a nation, to release ourselves from the mundane and to allow the spirituality to take over during that year. That is Rav Kook's take on the reason for Shemitah. And when eventually in week 3 or 4, we get to the thorny issue of the Heter Mechirah, we will come back to Rav Kook in some detail. So that's a quick whistle stop through some of the potential reasons for Shemitah. But let's now go back to the nuts and bolts, the nitty-gritty of the how to behave during Shemitah year. In the same way as Shabbat, again, here's another parallel with Shabbat. We're going to parallel Shabbat many times as we go through. There are categories of things that are forbidden from the Torah, and there are categories that are forbidden from the rabbis. Let's just use an example for Shabbat. For example, writing ktiva on Shabbat is forbidden by Torah law. Picking up a pen on Shabbat is forbidden by rabbinic law through the law of muktzah. Muktzah is not min haTorah. Muktzah is derabanan. It's a rabbinic law. So you have certain laws which are deoraita from the Torah itself, and certain laws which are derabanan. And the same thing applies in Shemitah. The four main categories, we said them before, they come from those psukim further up on page 1. They come from these psukim. Sowing, there we go. Sheish shanim tizra sadecha, b'shana shvi'it sadecha lo tizra. You shall not sow. Karmecha lo tizmor, you shall not prune. And lo tiktzor, over here, you shall not reap. And lo tivtzor, you shall not pick. So let's go back down to our four categories: sowing, pruning, reaping, and picking. Those are the av malachot, as it were. Those are the four main categories of forbidden activities during the Shemitah year.
Does it only mean picking grapes? Can you pick olives? Or
okay, good question, Hazel. And the answer is it means all picking, and we will come to it. We'll come to it later on. But it's a good question.
Thank you.
The pasuk says picking grapes, but then it says v'chein ta'aseh lecharmecha ulezeitecha, and it mentions olives, and the rabbis extend the picking to all fruits. But that's a very good question. Now let's go to the activities which are forbidden d'Rabbanan: watering, weeding, fertilizing, cutting, spraying pesticides, and any activity which promotes growth. Now, all of those things are a tolda. Tolda, you know what tolda means? Eile toldot Yitzchak, these are the generations of Yitzchak. The toldot malachot are the children, if you like, of the avot, of the father malachot. These are the father malachot, the main categories, and these are the subcategories. The rabbis forbade all of these activities on the basis of this one, pruning. Pruning. Now, I'm sure that we have here amongst our 30-odd participants some very keen gardeners. Those who are keen gardeners will tell you that when you prune something, it promotes growth. For example, you might find my wife in the garden chopping deadheads off, deadheading the flowers. Why do you do that? Because it promotes more growth. Why do we prune the trees? Because it promotes more growth. Why do we have a haircut? If we've got any hair left, those have still got a little bit. Why do we have a haircut? Well, we don't want to look like Wurzel Gummidge, but we all know that the more you cut your hair, the more it grows. So it's the same idea. So pruning, the reason that you're not allowed to prune is because pruning will promote growth. All of these things in these categories promote growth. If you water something, it will help it grow. If you weed your garden, you're going to tell me, well, that's not going to do anything. If you weed it, you're taking the weeds out. So you're doing the opposite of promoting growth. But you're not, are you? Why do you weed? Because the weeds take away the goodness of the soil from the plants that you want. So you take away the plants you don't want. I've always wondered, by the way, what makes a weed? I can sometimes be out on a walk with Elisheva, and I'll say, that's a nice flower there. And she'll say, that's a weed. I'll say, well, what makes it a weed? It's a nice flower. What makes that a weed and a daffodil not a weed? Well, the answer is, it's if you want it or you don't want it. If you want it, it's a flower. If you don't want it, it's a weed. So you weed, you take the ones you don't want because it helps promote the growth of the ones that you do want, because the nutrients in the soil are not stolen, as it were, by the weeds, and there's more of them available for the other flowers. So by weeding, you are strengthening the growth of the other plants. Fertilizing, well, that's obvious, isn't it? If you fertilize your plants, they're going to grow better. Cutting, we talked about cutting hair. This applies to cutting the lawn as well. Cutting the lawn. If you're cutting the lawn to promote growth, then that's a problem. We'll come to cutting the lawn later on when we get to how to behave in our garden in week 2. But suffice it to say, at the moment, it's in the categories of forbidden things, d'Rabbanan. Spraying pesticides, obviously, that's the same idea as fertilizing, isn't it? It's improving the growth. And number 6 is anything else that I can't think of that might promote the growth of your crops. So whatever it is that can promote your growth, you can't do it in Shemitah, because that is part of the malacha of pruning. Sowing, okay, sowing includes planting. Now in English, sowing is with seeds, planting is with plants, with seedlings, things that have already grown. Sowing, you sow with little grains, seeds, you put them in the ground, eventually they sprout, and then you can take them out of there and you can replant them somewhere else. When you go to the, what do they call it, the garden centre, you can buy little plants and you plant them. You don't sow them, you plant them. So you might think it's only sowing that is forbidden, but it's not. Planting falls into the same category. So what about reaping? Reaping means harvesting. So that means picking all the fruit. In Hebrew, there's different words for different types of harvesting. Harvesting, in the word harvesting in English, is a bit of a generic term. You can harvest wheat, you can harvest grapes, you can harvest produce generally. Kitsira, which is translated as harvesting, doesn't apply to grapes. Grapes has its own different word, and we saw it over here in our psukim, didn't we? Over here, where are we? Tizmor karmecha. So that's no, that's not zmira. Is pruning. Where are we? Tivtzor. There we go. Tivtzor. Betzira. That's picking of grapes. So we have different words in Hebrew for different things. But basically, it means harvesting the produce, whatever word you want to use for it. It means harvesting the produce. Now, we will see later on that there is this situation here, which we will discuss in a moment. But I want to just talk about harvesting. You're going to ask me, I hope, you're going to say to me, but hang on a minute, Lieberman. You just told me that in the psukim over here, V'haita Shabbat haaretz lachem la'ochla. You've got to eat this produce. That's what it's there for you, for your servant, for your hired workers, etc., for your animals. So if you've got to eat it, how are you going to eat it if you don't harvest it? You just told me you've got to eat it, and now you're telling me you can't harvest it. So what have you got to do? Go into the field and eat it while it's still connected to the ground. Get on your hands and knees and eat the raw wheat. No, of course not. So there must be some kind of caveat to the halakha that says you're not allowed to reap and you're not allowed to pick. And we will see that there is indeed a caveat about reaping and picking, which we'll see later on. So at the moment, as far as we've got so far, we've got 4 main categories of forbidden activity with some subcategories of rabbinic forbidden activities, which link into the 4 main categories of the Torah. And we've got the positive commandments. Here I've listed them for you. Number 1, to make the Shemitah produce ownerless. That's from our psukim in Shmot that we quoted above. That's being mafkir. Le'ochla, it's a mitzvah to eat Shemitah produce, like we said. And then kedushat shvi'it, to preserve the holiness of the Shemitah produce. That we will come to in week 2 or 3. And then bi'ur, which we will come to in week 3. This is removing Shemitah produce from the house when there is no longer anything left of that species in the field. That's a bit of an unknown, much less known halacha, and we'll come to that later on. So let's just talk over here about this sentence. In situations of financial loss, these activities are permitted. Because obviously, if you don't water your plants for an entire year, what's going to happen to them? They're going to die. They're going to die. And they're not going to take a year to die. Those of you who've got a watering system in your garden will know that if the battery goes on the little computer that tells it when to go on and off, whilst you happen to be away, like happened to us once, you will come back 2 weeks later and find your entire garden dead. Because if you don't water it, it won't live. So you're not expected, nor does HaKadosh Baruch Hu want you to lose your plants. So you're allowed to do whatever is necessary to prevent loss of your plants. In other words, you can do whatever you need to do, and you must do whatever you need to do to preserve your plants and trees. You can't improve them, but you must do what is necessary to preserve them. And that is a very important distinction. To preserve is permitted and obligatory. Otherwise, you're guilty of bal tashchit, of wasting. But to promote and improve growth, that you can't do. So you have to water just enough to make it survive, just enough to make it alive, to keep it going so it shouldn't die. But if you can, you should reduce the amount of water that you give your plants than you would normally give, so that you can keep the halacha of the Torah and of the rabbis of not watering. You don't water any more than you have to. Same for weeding. If you have a dreadfully aggressive weed plant which is strangling your tree, we had in our garden a beautiful bougainvillea plant, beautiful bright purple flowers. The only problem was it was next to the mango tree, and it was strangling the mango tree. The branches, the bougainvilleas are apparently, I talk as if I know what I'm talking about in the garden. I don't. I have absolutely no idea. But apparently, bougainvilleas are very aggressive growers, and we saw it in our garden. It was strangling the mango tree. So we had to get rid of the bougainvillea. So if that, during the Shemitah year, I had a tree or a plant that was going to strangle my plants and trees that were fruit bearing, such that they would destroy the tree, then I would be allowed to do the weeding, but only just enough to prevent that from happening, not to go the whole hog and take, more than is necessary. Fertilizing, it's difficult, I think, to have a scenario where you would have to fertilize. If you're going to tell me you've got plants that will not live the year unless you fertilize them, well, then what you ought to do is to try and be ahead of the game. I'm told by Rav Yosef Tzvi Rimon in his book that you can buy fertilizer that you can put down before Shemitah, which is slow release. It's a bit like the pills that you get, you know, the slow release pills that release over a period of time. You can get slow release fertilizer, apparently, which releases its fertilizing qualities over a long period of time, and you can put that down before Shemitah. Cutting. Now, that's an interesting one, because why do we cut the grass? Two reasons we might cut the grass. We might cut the grass because we want it to look nice. I always wanted to have those lines on my lawn, you know, where you can see, where you go, you see in the football pitches there, where you can see the squares and the beautiful lines. I have to say that I've never, ever achieved that. No matter how hard I tried, I have never achieved a line down the middle of my grass. However, we all want our grass to look nice. If you're cutting the grass to make it look nice, then there is no problem with that at all. That is not forbidden. However, if you are cutting the grass to promote growth, in other words, if you've got a bit of a bare patch and you want to make that bare patch filled in, and so you think, I tell you what, I'll cut the lawn nice and close, because the closer you cut it, apparently, the more that promotes the growth. There again, I'm talking that I know what I'm talking about. I'm only reading. I'm only telling you what I've read in the Shemita book. I can't claim any inside knowledge on gardening, but apparently, the closer you cut the grass, the more it promotes the growth. So when during Shemitah you're cutting your grass, you're not expected to leave your garden grass for a whole year and not cut it. It'll be a jungle out there. You're not expected to do that. You can cut the grass, but you have to be cutting the grass only to make it look nice, not to promote the growth. And just remember, if you're thinking of doing a little bit of a trick here and saying, well, I tell you what, I'll cut the grass to make it look nice, but actually it'd really be quite nice if it filled in that gap as well. So, you know, I'll just cut it a wee bit more. Just remember, HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows what's in your heart and what's in your mind. He knows what you're up to. And we will come back to that idea of doing things covertly when we talk about something called sefichim. And that will be a little bit later on in this course. So the basic rules that we've learnt so far, that there are underlying reasons for Shemitah which are not necessarily agricultural. There is an agricultural side effect, which is that letting the land lie fallow is a good idea from an agricultural point of view. But that isn't the main reason we do Shemitah. We do it to improve our midot, to improve our character traits, to remind us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the boss, to remind us that it's not kochi v'yotzim yadi, it's not all come from how wonderful a gardener I am, and it's to promote unity amongst the people and to help the poor and the stranger have food to eat. So that's what we've done so far. And we also have learned that we have positive commandments to make the Shemitah produce ownerless and to eat it and to preserve the Kedusha, which we will come to. So let's just drill down, if you'll pardon the pun, into these some of these halachot a little bit more deeply. And we will actually come to Hazel's question shortly, as well as to what the picking bit refers to. Does it just refer to grapes? So here's a little chart from Rav Rimon. What does the planting and the sowing refer to? Does it refer to the person, or does it refer to the land? In other words, what if the halacha against the prohibition against planting or sowing, let's use sowing because it's easier. Let's say, for argument's sake, that the halacha is that sowing is forbidden on the person. In other words, an individual Jew is forbidden to sow the field. What if it was done mechanically by a machine, and the machine did the sowing? You're going to say to me, well, what about the person working the machine? Well, you could argue that's just what we call grammar. You're just causing something to happen. That's one step removed. You haven't actually done the sowing. All you've done is press a button on a machine. So if the halacha refers to a person, it could be that a mechanical sowing may not be forbidden. But if the halacha refers to the land, in other words, the land should not be sown, as opposed to you shall not sow, then it doesn't matter whether it's done by a person or by somebody pressing a button. You have caused the land to be sown, and that's not allowed. So let's have a look what it applies to over here. This is at the bottom here. I've done the bottom before the top. Is planting by way of a mechanical seeder forbidden by Torah law? Now, you won't be surprised to know that the Chazon Ish, one of the, or probably the most well-known and highly regarded poskim of the 20th century in Eretz Israel, who lived in Bnei Brak and basically built up Bnei Brak. The Chazon Ish nearly always takes the most machmir position that you can find, takes the most stringent position. You may have heard of the idea of a Chazon Ish Shiur, which means the amount, the quantity that you need to eat on Pesach of a matzah. The biggest quantity is the Chazon Ish Shiur, because he always takes the most stringent view, or nearly always. And so he says, not surprisingly, planting by way of a machine is treated as a human action and therefore is forbidden by Torah law. It's a dioraita. Rav Frank, on the other hand, another one of the not quite contemporary but later poskim, says that mechanical sowing is really only a derivative. It's only a causative action, and therefore it's permitted by Torah law. He doesn't say that it's permitted completely. It's forbidden by rabbinic law, but there obviously is a difference between Torah law and rabbinic law. So there you have an idea of the land. What about what type of plants and trees does this whole thing apply to? Hazel asked the question earlier on about picking grapes. I'm asking the question here, a sort of parallel question about sowing and planting. Somebody today, this morning in shul, asked me a question about planting flowers. Does it only apply, he said, to planting vegetables and food, or does it also apply to planting flowers? This particular person was thinking about getting what we in England would call an allotment, a little patch of land to mess about with, to grow things on, and to work. And I said to him, it's a bit pointless getting one now because we're coming up to Shemita. You're not going to be able to do anything on it on a year. What are you going to do? Waste of time. Why don't you wait till after Shemita and then do it? So he said, well, what about if I'm not planting food, I'm planting flowers? So let's have a look. Does the prohibition of planting apply even to non-edible plants, such as flowers? Okay, the Chachamim go according to the Rambam, and that's who we paskin like. The prohibition applies to all plants. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is a dat yachid. He is an individual opinion, a single opinion. Not saying he's a nobody, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, but in the Talmud Yerushalmi, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says that the prohibition is limited only to edible plants. Why? Because the whole psukim that we're talking about is about food. So if we're only talking about food, it stands to reason that all the halachot are talking about food. However, we do not paskin like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. We paskin like the Rambam and the Chachamim. And lema'aseh, in practice, it applies to all plants. So it applies to your flowers in the garden, your plants in the garden, and anything else, even if it's not edible. So my friend who wanted to go and get the allotment will be wasting his rental money for the next 12 months and should save it for something better, like a Magnum, for example. Okay, so let's have a look about this little thorny issue, if you'll pardon the pun. What about planting inside the house, or a greenhouse, or hydroponics? Now, this is into the realm now of getting a bit tricky. And when I say a bit tricky, why is it that we Jews are so clever? We are clever, aren't we? I mean, let's face it, we are 0.001% of the population of the world and 30% of the Nobel Prize winners. We're a clever bunch, aren't we, really? And the reason that we're so clever is that Kadosh Baruch Hu gave us all sorts of difficult laws to keep. And we apply our ever-expanding brains to ways to get around the things that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has asked us to do. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu has said, don't plant. So some Chochem comes along and says, what if I'm not planting? What if I'm not growing in the land? What if I'm growing in a pot? What if I'm growing inside my house? That's not growing in the land. What if I'm growing in my 17th floor apartment? That's not planting in the land. I'm 17 floors up here. So these are the points we need to just quickly discuss. Question: is planting in a pot inside the house permitted? Now, for the purposes of this discussion, inside a house means under a roof. So a greenhouse in the garden where you have a roof and some walls there, a greenhouse means a house. So what about planting in a greenhouse? Or what about planting in a pot that is outside, but it's not under a roof, but it's in a pot? It's not actually in the ground. So you have a nice, like we do in our front garden, we have a nice big pot full of soil, which is stood on the tiles. It's actually stood on a saucer on the tiles, and in it grows a kumquat tree. Now, is that planting? Can I plant something in there? Or is that not planting? I'm not planting in the ground because the ground is beneath the tiled floor. So let's drill down a bit further. Let's go down the right-hand side of the page first. Planting indoors. Well, we talk, the Psukim talk about the field and the land, and here we go. We have a machloket. We have a difference of opinion, and here we have the Chazon Ish again. And guess what? The Chazon Ish takes the more machmir position, takes the more stringent position, and says that if you plant inside, that is a Torah law. You can't do it, says the Chazon Ish. The Peyat HaShulchan, another one of the poskim, says it is permitted because actually we're not sure, and it's only a rabbinic law because it's under a roof, and therefore it's permitted. So let's have a look and see. There are two leniencies here. Planting indoors, having a roof over, and being in a pot. We need to go down the left-hand side now till we come to the bottom. What about planting in a pot? Now, we have two types of pot, don't we? We have a pot which has a hole in it at the bottom to allow drainage. And atzitz, by the way, is a modern Hebrew word as well. It means a planter. So those things that you plant your plants in, those nice wooden things or ceramic things or earthenware things, pots, those are called atzitz. Atzitz nakuv. Nakuv means it's got a hole in it. You know that word from your bracha when you go to the toilet and when you get up in the morning. Nekevim, nekavim. Nekavim, nekavim. It's a hole. Atzitz nakuv is a pot with a hole in it. So if you have, imagine you have a pot stood in your garden and it's got a hole in it, effectively that's in the ground, isn't it? Because you've got a connection with the ground. So according to all opinions really, an atzitz nakuv outside, not in a greenhouse, a planter with a hole in it is as if there was no planter there. You might as well just plant in the ground, and that is forbidden by Torah law. Now, what about a planter which does not have a hole in it? Well, if you ask my wife that, she'll tell you you can't do that because it won't drain and it'll get soggy and the plant will die because the water will just get soggy every time you water it and there's nowhere to drain for it and it won't do very well. Because I suggested that on a couple of occasions and she said, nah, it won't work. But let's say for argument's sake, that's what you did. You had a planter without a hole in it, or you have a planter that you can actually buy commercially, a planter which is lined with that thick black plastic. Those of you who buy planters from proper places that are lined with thick black plastic will look very carefully and see a few perforations in there. You'll see that they actually have little holes in the black plastic because otherwise it won't drain, like my wife says. But let's say you made your own and you made a planter and you got this thick black plastic and you lined the thing and it now becomes a planter without a hole in it. If it's outside, it is not forbidden by Torah law to plant because you're not planting in the ground, you're planting in a pot. However, the rabbis said, whoa, hang on a minute, that's a bit too close to planting. So they forbade it. That is forbidden by rabbinic law. Okay? Now, if you take two leniencies, that is called, one lenience is called a safek. It's a doubt. Another safek on top of it is called a sveka, a double doubt, so a double leniency, shvut deshvut. So if you put an unperforated pot inside a greenhouse, you can rely on the opinions. Even the Chazon Ish says you can rely on the lenient opinion in that situation because inside the house, inside the greenhouse, is only by rabbinic law and not Torah law, and an unperforated pot is also a rabbinic law. So you've got two leniencies. Two leniencies means that you can be lenient even according to the Chazon Ish. So if you are desperate to grow something during Shemita Shiur, then you can rely on the idea of having an inside pot in a greenhouse or inside your house in a pot which is not perforated, an unperforated and unholed pot. So there we have planting inside. Now, what about hydroponics? What about hydroponics? Now, again, I claim no gardening knowledge here, but as I understand it, hydroponics involves growing produce on water alone without any soil. Now, there is nothing in those psukim. Let's go back to the top. There is nothing in those psukim there that says you shall not grow in water. It says you shall not plant or sow your field. You could argue that a field is not a garden, but a garden is like a field. You could argue that a pot is not a field, but it's like a field. Nobody could argue that a bathtub is a field. And so, where are we? There we go. There we go. So hydroponics is okay. You can grow anything you want hydroponically, perfectly legally, halachically, as long as it is obviously hydroponic. Because if it isn't obviously hydroponic, then you may have a problem of marit ayin, of a problem of it looking like a forbidden activity. So, for example, it would not be a good idea to go and sit in the window of the tray for McDonald's eating your own home-cooked kosher beef burger, because it would look like you were eating one of McDonald's treif ones, and that would be marit ayin. So hydroponics is okay, but be careful of marit ayin. Okay, we have already run out of time, and I haven't got anywhere near finished what I wanted to finish today. So I can definitely tell you we will not finish this in 3 weeks. We may not even finish it in 4. But those of you who are interested will stick with me. Those of you who are not, obviously, will not. And you know what? You can have your money back. So we will stop there because I think we've done quite a lot today. I am going to invite you. I'm going to invite you to unmute yourselves and ask questions in a moment. I would rather, because I can only see half of you at any one time, because I've got two screens, as it were, because there's too many of you to go on one screen. I'm not necessarily going to hear you if you shout out and know who it is. So if let's start by trying to press the hands up icon on your Zoom, like Charlie or Vivian has just done now. Those of you that have got the gallery view on will see a little hand, a little blue and white hand that's come up in the top left-hand corner of Charlie Simonoff's screen. That's what happens if you press your button. If you could do that, I will then immediately see you've got your hand up, and then I'll be able to invite you to say your question. So if you could keep yourselves muted until it's your turn to ask the question, I'll be able to hear the question and then answer it. So let's start with Charlie or Viv. Your question or comment, please.
I'm fascinated about the pots indoors. I can understand if it's sitting with a hole in it and it's sitting on the ground, I can understand the concern. Nowadays, most of the pots with a hole in it that you have indoors sit on a pot saucer, so actually there's no contact with the land or with the floor.
Correct. And so, you could argue, couldn't you, that even if it's got a hole in it and it's not stood on anything, if it's inside, it's not in the land.
Yep.
But it's certainly not forbidden according to Torah law if it's inside with a hole. But if it's outside with a hole, then it's forbidden by Torah law. Inside with a hole, right? Inside with a hole is forbidden by rabbinic law because partly it's a geder. Remember our concept when we were learning other halachot of the yellow line on the platform. right? You don't stand over the yellow line, not because that last meter is dangerous. It's dangerous if you go on the line. But if you go over the yellow line, you might just fall. You might make a mistake and fall off. The problem is when our yellow line gets put back 10 kilometers from the platform edge, and we get chumrah over chumrah over chumrah. So here it's forbidden to have a pot with a hole in, according to rabbinic law, inside, so that it prevents you from thinking that a pot with a hole in is okay and taking it outside and putting it in your garden, where you are then over a halacha deoraita because you have, as it were, planted. Okay? Does that answer your question?
Right. Sadly, yes.
Sadly, yes. Okay. I think the next one was Jeanette. Jeanette, where are you? Gone. Okay. Okay. Paul.
You mentioned earlier that you couldn't go into someone's land without permission. But you can't withhold permission for picking the fruit, but you can withhold permission to enter your land. But then you also said you have to abandon your land. So the two things don't seem to add up.
Very good question. Very good question. You can't just come into my garden whenever you want, because I have some kind of privacy rights. Okay. However, I have to let you come in at some point to pick the fruit. Okay. It's not the fact, it isn't my land, that's true, but you can't just come in, Stan. I've got to let you in. And what you will find in the Shemita year, Paul, I give you full notice now. Can't tell you exactly what it will say, but there will be a notice on my gate that says the gate will be open for those who wish to come and pick my grapefruits and whatever else is there at that particular time, at such and such a time, on such and such a day of the week. Now, I could be mean and say it will be available between 1 and 1:05 a.m. On Thursday night, but that would not be in the spirit of what we're meant to be doing. So you have to respect privacy. The owner, inverted commas, of the land has to allow everybody else to come and get it. And you're right. Ideally, you should be mafkir the whole thing. And if I had a field which was not connected to my house, as is my garden, then the correct thing to do would be to open the gate and allow everybody to come in. You're also allowed to protect your property, even though it's not your property, it's going to be your property again later on, and you're allowed to protect it from damage. So whilst you're not allowed to own it during that year, you're allowed to be a bit of a chochem and say, I'm not going to allow people just to trample through and make a big balagan, because you're not allowed to do that. That's damaging. But you must allow people to come in and pick the fruit, because it's not your fruit anymore that year. It's for everybody. So it's a balance. So you're absolutely right, Paul, to point out that contradiction, but it's a practical contradiction as opposed to a theoretical. Well, it's a theoretical contradiction as opposed to a practical one. Who's next? Rivka and Ateret.
Hi, I have a question. What about salt farms and mushrooms?
Okay, I did say to you I'm not an expert gardener. Why are you asking me that question? Explain to me why that's a question.
Because in the halachot of Kotzer on Shabbat, then salt in salt farms and mushrooms count as growing things, but they're not actually plants as we know them. So do they count for Shmita? Okay,
I'm not sure what a salt farm is, excuse my ignorance. So let's deal with mushrooms, shall we? I don't know off the top of my head without looking it up whether mushrooms are, to pick mushrooms would be forbidden al pi haTorah midoraita. I don't know. I'd have to look that up. From what you said, there could well be a position to say that it's not a growing thing, and therefore you're not being kotzer, you're not reaping it, and therefore it's out of that category. I would hazard a guess that at the very least it would be a derabanan, because it is at the very least ke'ilu kotzer. It is at the very least like reaping. And if we, as we know, the isurei derabanan are there for things which are like dioraita, for example, eating meat and milk together, we know that actually al pi halacha, al pi Torah, to eat chicken and milk produce together is not forbidden, but it's like eating meat and milk together, so the rabbis forbade it. So I don't know off the top of my head, because I'm not well enough up on gardening and things, but I would be very surprised if it would be permitted. It may not be an Isur Dioraita. I will try and look it up and answer your question when we next meet.
Thank you.
Hilary.
Hi, sorry, you may already have answered this question because I lost my contact. I've had to go onto my iPad. About the plants in pots with a hole, what did you say if they're on a tiled patio without a roof?
No, that counts as outside, I'm afraid.
Even though you're not in the land, you're not.
Yeah, it's not in the. I did answer that sort of before when Vivian asked the question. I'll just repeat it. If it's inside and it's got a hole in it, you're going to say, well, it's not near the land, and you're going to say the same thing about being outside on a tiled thing or on a pot. But the rabbis are worried that you might then go and put it outside, not on a pot. So it's a geder, it's a fence around the halacha. It's the yellow line a meter away from the platform's edge.
But you're allowed to give it just enough water to keep it alive.
Indeed, you can do that even if it's planted in the ground outside directly. Not only can you, you must. You're not allowed to allow it to die, just stand. That would be Baal Tashchit.
Okay.
Johnny?
Yes, yes.
I'm going to ask you a question. It might sound really stupid, but I don't mean it to be. What about potato crisps?
What?
Well, they're potatoes, aren't they? Aren't they cut from potatoes?
No.
They're not?
No.
Okay. It's not a stupid question, surprisingly.
Thank you.
It's not a stupid question. And in fact, I think I spotted earlier on the chat, just whizzed before my eyes. Yes, here we go. Rachel wrote, manufactured food products can go on for years. And Rachel is right. The problem that we have with Shmita is this. Potato crisps are made from potatoes. Now, those potatoes, what if they're made from Shmita produce? What if those crisps are made from Shmita produce? You may have a problem. And that's why it's always a good idea when you are eating things that are made in Israel to have things with a hechsher. Because with a hechsher, it will often tell you, and it won't say this necessarily in year 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13, but in year 7 and 8, it may well say on the hechsher, it will say, Lo lechashash shviit orla, or whatever. It was not to have a worry about Shmita. In other words, the hechsher tells you that the potatoes that these crisps were made from did not come from Shmita produce. Now, if you are in England or anywhere else in Chutz La'aretz and you buy a packet of Walker's crisps, which are kosher and are made from potatoes from who knows where, the chances are they're not made from Israeli potatoes, and so you don't need to worry. If, however, you buy a packet of crisps in Rami Levy, and if you were able to find a packet of crisps that didn't have a hechsher on, then which would probably be quite difficult. I always say, actually, you really have to go out of your way to eat treif in Israel. It's not so easy. In Chutz La'aretz, you have to go out of your way to eat kosher. In Eretz Israel, you have to go out of your way to eat treif. If you were to be able to find a packet of crisps in the supermarket which didn't have a hechsher on, then you would be advised in Shemita Year, certainly in the end of Shemita Year and the next year, not to eat them and to choose a packet with a hechsher on for that exact reason. So it's not a stupid question. It's actually a very good question, and it applies to any manufactured food products in year 8, year 7 and 8, and sometimes I suppose even in year 9, depending on how old the produce is before it gets to the shelves. Any other questions? I haven't lowered your hand, Paul. Is it still up, or does it need lowering? Lowering. Okay. There we go. What about you, Hilary? Have you finished now? Yes. Okay. Any other questions?
Can I ask a question?
Who's speaking?
Stanley Mason.
Hello, Stanley. Yes, of course you may. How nice to see you. I can't see you, but I can hear you. Go ahead, Stanley.
I wanted to ask, are you allowed to buy or sell the land during Shmita?
Okay, that we will come to towards the end of our course, because that is a very, very thorny question. It is the question of what is known as the heter mechira. In very briefly, Rav Kook, at a certain time at the beginning of the 20th century, gave permission to sell the land to a non-Jew in the same way as we sell our chametz on Erev Pesach to a non-Jew. It is a very contentious argument. Some people will allow it and some people won't, and I will go into it in some great detail towards the end of this course. It's a very important issue, and probably the most important issue that we here in Eretz Israel, in terms of how we behave in our shopping and our eating. It's probably the most important question that we will answer, and I will give it a very thorough treatment towards the end of this course, probably in week 4 of a 3-week course. That would be good, wouldn't it? So Stanley, hold your question if you can, because it's a very important question, perhaps the most important question of all, and we'll come to it in due course. Yes, Rachel. You're muted. You'll have to unmute, please.
Sorry. I've actually asked you that in writing, but I don't know if you've seen that. Today we can get around it with all the modern methods with hydroponics and so on, and buying imported stuff. But did God mean for them not to have their 5 a day, not to plant their cucumbers and whatever, lettuce and stuff like that, because that's annual?
Absolutely. We will come to annuals next week when we talk about sefichim. There's something called sefichim. We will talk about planting annuals, planting vegetables. For sure, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to eat our 5 a day. And this will, I will reiterate the concept which is here on your screen at the top. I will reiterate this pasuk over and over again, le'ochla, for food. We are meant to eat it. It's not as we chutzniks, as I was and some of you are, have our situation there where you just can't get around it because you don't know, and most of the Israeli produce is not grown and harvested correctly. Here in Israel, there are methods of being able to harvest correctly, and we will come to exactly that. That was part 3. Part 1 was the halachot, which we have started to go through. I'll finish that at the beginning of next week. Part 2 is how to behave with our Shemitah produce once we have it, how to behave in the garden and the kitchen. And part 3 is how to behave in the shops, and how to make sure that we keep Shemitah in the best possible way. Let me just finish by saying what I meant to say right at the beginning, which this should have been the opening sentence. It is a massive, massive privilege to keep the mitzvot of Shemitah. Shemitah can only be kept in Eretz Yisrael. There's a machloket ben poskim between the rabbis as to whether the whole inyan of Shemitah is deoraita or derabanan, whether it's a Torah law or it's a rabbinic law today. Some opinions are that it's only a Torah law when most of the Jews of the world live in Eretz Yisrael. By the way, we're not there yet, but we're not far off it. And the way that Aliyah is growing, it's not going to be that many years before. The way Aliyah is growing, and in America, assimilation is growing, it's not going to be long before it changes that the most of the Jews in the world are in Eretz Yisrael. And then, according to all the opinions, Shemitah will be a Torah law. But it's a massive privilege to keep the laws of Shemitah. And therefore, it's important that we try to keep them and don't try not to keep them. And I'll go into that in more detail when I talk about the Heter Mechira, and when I talk about a pet hate of mine called Yavul Nochri, non-Jewish produce. And I'll talk about that in week 3 or 4. So that has taken us an hour and a half. I knew I was being a bit optimistic at 3 weeks. I might even be optimistic in 4, but I can only go as fast as I can go. I don't want to rush it. Those of you who think I'm going too slow, I'm sorry. Those of you who've got other things to do on a Tuesday night after the next 3, you can always listen to the recording. Any more questions or comments before we stop? No, in that case, I shall wish you a good night. The recording will be made available hopefully tomorrow. It will be posted on all the Tchelet fora of WhatsApp and Facebook and email. We do also have a website at Tchelet, but I'm afraid it's not really as up and as running as it should be, because our website person, who's very kindly volunteered to do it, is a bit busy, and we really need a new website anyway, but it will be put on there as well. But out between WhatsApp, email and Facebook, you should be able to find the recording if you want it, or if you want to pass it on to anybody else. I'd be very happy for that to happen. So I will, please God, see you all next week for round 2. Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Are we on for tomorrow morning?
What's tomorrow morning? Gemara Shir.
Are we on for tomorrow morning? Yes.
Yes, Gemara Shir tomorrow morning.